Welcome back everyone. The iPad mini 3 has been out for many years now, so let's go and see how this iPad holds up in 2022. Now, I probably wouldn't recommend buying this iPad by any means necessary in 2022. This is a pretty old iPad, but that's not to say that this iPad can't be used for something. So I think that has something going for it. But this is an 8-year-old iPad almost at this point, and because of that, I probably wouldn't recommend buying this, but I will leave some iPads I would recommend in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now on the outside of the iPad mini 3, we do have that 7.9-inch IPS panel. Now this is, I guess, a Retina panel, and funny enough, there were pretty much no differences from the iPad Air 2, from the iPad mini 2, to the iPad mini 3. They were pretty much the same exact iPads, except this one actually had Touch ID on the front. Now this one came out in 2014, around the same time the iPhone 5S came out. So this thing brought that Touch ID sensor that the iPhone 5S brought. So beyond that, the panel I think still looks pretty decent in this day and age. It's definitely not like an iPad, Pro panel of nowadays, but it's not bad, and I actually do think the panel of this thing is pretty interesting. Now, funny enough, one of the biggest differentiating factors, and one of the reasons I loved the iPad mini lineup back in this day when these things came out, was actually the size of the bezels. The side bezels were much smaller than the top and bottom, making it seem like it was just such a different type of iPad, and I loved this type of design choice. Since then, we have bezel-less iPads and all those things, but this was a really cool thing that Apple did. Now we have the top and bottom bezel, we had the front-facing camera as well, which was really cool. Having a front-facing camera, able to take, FaceTime calls and, calls just in general is really cool, and we have that type of capability on the iPad mini 3. Now we have a lightning port on this thing as well, including a headphone jack, which is really cool. On the back, we have that Apple logo, which sits right in the middle, which looks beautiful, the aluminum back all across, and we have a single camera setup as well. Now these iPads, pretty much like all other iPads, do not have IP certification, they don't have wireless charging, they don't have anything super crazy like that, and with this iPad, we don't really have like a USB Type-C port that we have on the current iPad mini 6. We don't have, like a way better camera setup. This is a pretty outdated, tablet when it comes down to it, but the body of this thing still feels pretty premium. It does not feel like a cheap iPad, and I've said this for so many years now, but Apple really has never made a cheap iPad. All of them felt extremely premium. Even their cheapest iPad 9th generation still feels pretty premium. So I think with something like this, of course it's not perfect, but I think it gets the job done for the most part. However, the camera setup is a little bit of a different story. On the back, we have a 5 megapixel standard lens, and on the front, we have a 1.2 megapixel lens. Now we can only do 1080p videos on the back, we can only do 720p videos on the front, and that should kind of tell you where this iPad kind of sits at. It is not a good camera nowadays. It's not even like it's not even like a camera I would, recommend using if you have any type of phone in your, vicinity. Basically, an iPhone 6 camera is substantially better than this thing. I would even say an iPhone 5S camera, probably even an iPhone 5 camera, is better than this thing as well. This camera is grainy, especially with something as big as the iPad mini's display. It gives the impression that the photos and videos you're taking are severely grainy, and that's not really a good look for this type of iPad, to be honest. It's not an ugly iPad camera, but I think the way to look at it is, this thing has a camera with it. It's not the go-to camera choice, but it's something there, and if you need to go and pick up an iPad with a camera on it, well, you have an option here. So I think that's one way to look at it. But again, this thing is pretty outdated when it comes down to the camera standpoint, and I would not recommend even talking about this camera or even thinking about using this camera unless you're doing FaceTime calls or something and this iPad just happens to be there. So in terms of the camera quality, that kind of covers it up there. Now, in terms of software, this iPad, like I mentioned before, is severely outdated with software. It stopped at iPadOS 12, specifically I think 12.5.5. Now that happened many, iPadOS 12 ended many years ago. That wasn't like yesterday. So this iPad is completely outdated with software. This thing matches the iPhone 6 pretty much. So, I'm probably going to tell you that this iPad isn't really secure anymore. It's definitely not, the iPad with the most amount of features. So you're still stuck in a situation where this iPad is just kind of not really worth it in terms of a software standpoint. Now again, that doesn't mean it's a bad iPad, but it didn't really even live that long compared to all the other devices. It still lasted quite a bit of time. The iPad mini 2 lasted way longer than a lot of people thought. But with this iPad, it just is outdated with software, so there's really no other way to put it. So if this thing got iPadOS 13 even, that would be a little bit of a different story. But iPadOS 12 is a pretty outdated version of software, and there's really no point in picking up this iPad because of that. So that kind of covers it up there. Now in terms of performance, this is actually pretty funny. This thing has that Apple A7 chip inside of it with 1 GB of RAM. So let me break this down. This iPad pretty much has the same exact thing going for it as an iPhone 5S. So the iPhone 5S performance is almost identical to this iPad. But a big thing to keep in mind is that this iPad is a much bigger tablet with a much bigger display, and it has way more pixels to push on the display as well compared to an iPhone 5S. So you're going to be getting quite a bit of a glitchy experience. Not everything, but most things are going to be glitchy on this thing, but it gives the impression that it may be a fast device, which is so crazy. When you feel this thing and you hold it, it doesn't feel like it's going to perform bad. It's not like it's made out of plastic or something. It's a pretty, premium feeling device. But it's not until you actually start using it that's when you start seeing that this iPad actually does have some problems up its sleeves. It's a very choppy experience, and another thing that I've seen time and time again with this iPad is even doing things like split screen multitasking or going from one app to the other with the gesture-based design, it just doesn't really give me a strong experience with it. It is severely choppy, and that is probably one of the biggest problems with something like using an iPad at this caliber. It is an outdated machine. Now, that's not to say it was bad when it first came out. I think when it first came out, it was decent. I think a lot of people saw it as something as like the iPad mini 2, just without Touch ID. That's pretty much the main difference. But this would not be an iPad I would pick up to pretty much use on an everyday basis. If you're a student and you're on a budget, I would still not buy this iPad. I would even recommend either using your phone for the time being, or you can buy an iPad mini 5. Those things have gone down in value quite a bit in the used market as well, and that is going to be giving you a much, much better experience than this thing. And I'm not even comparing this thing to the iPad mini 6 or the latest iPads. Just using it as it is and just kind of, thinking about using it on an everyday basis, it would not be a good experience. Another big thing to keep in mind is that a lot of applications, sooner than later, they're probably already starting, they're not really going to be supported on iPadOS 12 anymore. So because of that, you are going to be in a better situation if you get an iPad that is supported for the next several years. That way you can go ahead and actually, utilize those applications. So I think in terms of that, the performance side, it's just not one of its best looks here, and it's probably one of the weirder aspects of this iPad, to be completely honest. Now, in terms of the battery life, this thing does have a 6,470 mAh battery inside of it. And that's not a bad sized battery. That's actually a pretty decent sized battery within it. And I definitely do think the battery life of this thing is one of the better aspects. But the problem with the battery life is that this iPad isn't a brand new iPad. Unless somehow you got your hands on a brand new iPad, then that's pretty incredible. But if not, then this iPad is pretty much degraded in battery for 8 years. So because of that, if somebody was using this iPad quite a bit and they went to, sell it, and then somebody else bought it and they used it for quite a bit, and now you're planning on buying it or something, well, this iPad battery has probably degraded a lot. It may be, luckily, if you get it, if you're in a good situation, it may be over 90%. That'd be pretty incredible. But most of the time, it's probably going to be around 80, 70, maybe even 60% battery health, depending on how much the previous people used it. I've owned iPhones that were way newer than this that are like at 70%. So I'll definitely tell you battery size is totally dependent on how you pretty much, have used this iPad. So that kind of covers it up there. And to be completely honest, this iPad, like I mentioned before, isn't really worth it. The lowest iPad I would recommend even buying is something like an iPad mini 5. Although the iPad mini 4 is still supported, I think for the most part, it just doesn't make any sense to buy that iPad. The mini 3 is definitely not worth it. The lowest I would recommend is the iPad mini 5. But again, you can always buy something like an iPad 7th generation, an iPad 8th generation, or iPad 9 that's currently being sold. And those are relatively cheaper iPads than the iPad mini lineup. Now this thing you can probably buy for like $100 something, but I would recommend buying an iPad 7 or 8th generation, probably for around that less than $200 price tag. And you are going to be getting a much better machine than this thing. So that kind of covers it. If you have any other questions or anything, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.